Go get your coffee and join me for GHC Coffee Break this morning. And Sherry Green from Georgia Highlands College will be joining me. We'll be talking about learning disabilities. Get your coffee and we'll be right back.
The color in my garden keeps the pink in my cheeks. I was very independent and thought I could take care of myself. I fell and I had to have Meals on Wheels. They're my savior. My name is Lola Silvestri. America, let's do lunch.
Drop off a hot meal and say hello. Volunteer by donating your lunch break at americaletsdolunch.org.
Welcome to GHC Coffee Break. Joining me today is Sherry Green from Georgia Highlands College. I'm so excited to have you today, Sherry.
Thank you so much, Susan, for having me.
How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful.
Great.
Yes.
I'm so excited to have you here. March is not only Learning Disabilities Month, but also Developmental Disabilities Month. And you are one of the education teachers at Georgia Highlands College, and I thought it would be great to have you on the show. I think this is the first time I've actually had you on the show.
Yes, it is.
Sorry it's taken me so long to get you here.
It's been a while.
So I'm glad to have you here. You're just in my living room, so we're going to kind of chat about. I want to start off about learning disabilities. I know a lot of people, and we can kind of incorporate both because March is both learning and developmental disabilities. I know that's one of your areas and I believe one of the classes you specifically teach,
right.
And special ed.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of your areas.
Mm-hmm.
But let's talk a little bit about, I think there's a lot of confusion about the difference between developmental disabilities and learning disabilities. Can you kind of differentiate the two?
Well, learning disabilities is the largest category of identified disabilities in the state of Georgia and actually nationwide. So when we look at all of the 13 different areas of disabilities, learning disabilities is the largest category. Developmental disabilities are disabilities that are primarily diagnosed very early on, that are noticeable at birth. These are disabilities that may involve ambulatory issues, may involve certainly brain development. They may have developed in utero. They may have developed as a result of something that happened during delivery. And so a lot of times developmental disabilities are present at birth and they are noticeable at birth.
Okay.
Whereas your learning disabilities are more of an academic type of disability that is identified as a child gets into school and is unable to keep up academically. And then a teacher might see that a child has fallen behind. And learning disabilities tend to be diagnosed later on in a child's school academic career. For example, maybe second grade, third grade, fourth grade. A developmental disability is going to be much more noticeable very early in life, so that that child can receive services during the infant, toddler stages can be referred to, for example, babies can't wait. And then once the child is 3 years of age, then the school system can, or actually is required by law to provide services to that child. And a lot of those children come in as developmentally delayed because the school system is not really sure how to categorize the disability. Mm-hmm. So they prefer not to label that child as a particular, having a particular disability. So what they will do is to label them the generic kind of developmental disability. And then they'll wait till the child gets in school and see the characteristics of the disability as they kind of play out later on over the next several years. And then when the child reaches 6, that's when a child has to have either a learning disability diagnosis and eligibility, or you know, an autistic disability, autism, or another health impairment or a visual impairment, you know, one of the other 13 categories. So we kind of, early on, if we're not sure, we may label that child or say that this child has a developmental disability of unknown origin, of unknown type. We will provide services, and we will watch that child grow and develop until they get about 6 years of age, and then by then we will have worked with that child for 3 years or so. And at that time, then we will go through some additional assessments and determine whether or not that child, you know, has a specific area that we can identify that child will be, you know, eligible for services. Contrasting that to learning disabilities, that tends to wait until later on in the early childhood education years, when it's manifested much more so in an academic environment.
Now, kind of in my early professional, I started out with kind of in the developmental disabilities. I started out when Public Law 94-142, the early intervention, birth through 3. Is that still being implemented, or is that?
It is.
Okay.
It is. When a child is born with suspected disabilities, that child is referred to to Babies Can't Wait.
Okay.
And Babies Can't Wait in the state of Georgia is a state agency, and that child and the family is referred to Babies Can't Wait, and then those people actually provide services to that child in the home.
Okay.
And then up until age 3. And then at age 3, the parent can take the child to the local school system for which they are zoned for, and then the school system is responsible for assessing that child for potential preschool special needs. Okay. And so that child is assessed, and then if that child is eligible for services, then that child receives services beginning at age 3 through the special needs preschool program for the school system. And then if they're not sure what the area of disability is, they will not identify and place that category on that child. They will just say this child is pervasive developmentally delayed, or significantly developmentally delayed, or just developmentally delayed. And that eligibility report will remain with that child until that child gets to 6 years of age. Okay. And at that time, they will delineate which area of disability that child has. So the state says by a certain point in time, you need to know, is this child autistic, or is this child Angelman syndrome, or, you know, what is this child's disability? Okay. And a lot of times that involves getting the medical field involved, and getting medical reports, and getting various other agencies involved with the child to help you make that determination as to, you know, how is this child functioning. And so it truly helps to have your outside resources to assist in the identification of that child's disability, because some disabilities overlap, and they're comorbid, meaning that a child may have more than one disability at the same time. And some disabilities have similar characteristics. For example, I actually have a nephew who is, well, not a nephew, I guess he's a second nephew or a grandnephew. He has Angelman syndrome, but when early, and he's about to be 3, he is, you know, many of the characteristics that he exhibited are very similar to autism. He's nonverbal.
Okay.
And some of the characteristics that we noticed very early on when he was 1 and 2, you know, we noticed that they mirrored autism.
Okay.
But then when his parents began to take him to the medical doctors, and he had some characteristics of Angelman syndrome that I was unaware of because it's such a rare disability. He had the blonde hair, the head, the back of his skull was flat, and he had blue eyes.
Okay.
So he had blonde hair, blue eyes, and he had a flat skull. And I had never worked with an Angelman syndrome child, but to me, some of the characteristics much more mirrored autism. But throughout the blood work and the genetic screening that was done, they determined that it was Angelman syndrome. So they were actually able to identify him fairly early instead of labeling him developmental disabilities.
Okay.
Yes.
So, because like I said, when I started, I actually worked with, it was called the Early Bird program back in the 80s, mid 80s, I guess. And it was through a grant. They started a lot of grants to start these programs to work with the birth through 3.
Right.
And then I worked in downtown Atlanta for a long time, for 7.5 years, I guess, with birth through 3. It was called then the Rehabilitation Center for Adults and Children. Birth through 3 in a classroom. And the kids had cerebral palsy, developmental and physical disabilities, and then I worked. So that's kind of where I started. And then, so we're talking about the developmental disabilities. When we come back, we've got about 3 minutes of this segment, and we'll talk more on the learning disabilities on our second segment. But kind of I started off with the developmental disabilities.
Right.
That was my kind of my professional start, mostly with mental retardation, the developmental disability area, using kind of the multiple disciplinary physical therapy, social work, occupational therapy. I did a lot of tactile therapy with them, touch therapy. Had kids with Dandy-Walker syndrome.
Yes.
A lot of kids who had tactical issues where they learning how to walk, didn't want their feet to touch the ground, having to use different things to get them motivated to even let their feet touch anything.
Right.
That kind of disabilities.
Right,
Severe
right.
physical and mental
Right.
disabilities.
Right. And the school systems provide services, of course, for the children who have sensory processing issues or sensory issues. We have children in our school systems today that have hypersensitive hearing, and they get into a school lunchroom, and you see them going around with their hands over their head, their ears, because they cannot take the noise level that's there, or there's certain foods that they don't want to touch each other on a plate, or there are certain textures that they don't like to touch. Yes, and so occupational therapy goes in, and a therapist works with them on the tactile and the rubbings, and a lot of children have weighted vests, and those kinds of things that help them to deal with the sensory issues.
And I don't think people realize the sensory impact for a lot of these kids with these type of disabilities, that it's a big struggle.
It is.
And very
it
high
impacts,
impact.
yes, it impacts their learning, it impacts their social life in schools, it impacts their relationships with other children. So yes, it impacts their whole world in that environment.
Absolutely. Well, we only have a couple of seconds in this segment, so get your coffee and we'll be right back with GHC Coffee Break.
My college offers classes that meet my educational and career goals.
With opportunities outside the classroom.
Where the faculty know me by name.
My college can prepare me for my career.
I can earn an associate's degree and transfer credits toward my bachelor's.
My college is a state college within the university system of Georgia.
My college is affordable.
It's close to home.
My college has online opportunities.
It's where excellence begins.
We are
GHC, Georgia Highlands College.
Welcome back to GHC Coffee Break. Joining me is Sherry Green, one of our professors at Georgia Highlands College with our education program. One of her specialty areas is developmental disabilities and learning disabilities. We talked a lot about developmental disabilities. I want to get into the learning disabilities and talk about that, and I'm also going to include something I don't think I gave you a heads up, but another impact with the learning disabilities, and I know it's a big passion for you, is the bullying aspect of it.
Yes.
But let's talk a bit about learning disabilities and their impact in the school system, and what a learning disability really is. Mm-hmm. I know it's going to be broad though.
Oh yes, and I think before we go there, what I really want to mention is that in the United States, we have 50 different states, and each state has their own definition of what a learning disability is. And so they have their own definition, their own eligibility requirements for special education services, and a lot of people don't realize that. So people who are mobile, who move quite frequently, the child may have services in the state of Georgia, but if that family moves to another state in the United States, that child has to qualify again for services in the various eligibility categories.
Wow.
And so in some states, a child may qualify for services and be provided those services, but if they move to another state, they may not meet the eligibility requirements in that state for the same services that they were being provided for in their previous state. So it's like we have 50 different special education eligibility requirements. And that's difficult for parents to understand. So I did want to mention that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's been a long time since I've been in the field in that area,
yes.
So I did not realize that.
Yes, and it becomes very problematic for families who move for whatever reason. But relative to the learning disabilities, it is one of the categories of eligibility for services in special education. And but the federal government has certainly provided for a lot more processing and due processing for students in each of those eligibility categories, from learning disabilities to intellectual disabilities to autism and other health impairments and so forth. And so what happens is that a student with a suspected learning issue, learning difficulty, will go through what's called a response to intervention. It's called RTI in our school systems. And it's somewhat of a different process than what it was, say, for example, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, a child used to go through what's called student support services or student support team. And the child would have an academic teacher, or the teacher would notice that the child was falling behind, either in reading or written expression or math calculation or math reasoning. And the teacher would provide some accommodations and then would make a referral to the student support team for a process to begin to determine whether or not the student was in fact experiencing a true disability rather than just a learning problem. Now that process has changed, and teachers, general ed teachers, are required to go through a multi-tiered kind of a hierarchical tier of interventions before they ever get to the point where they refer that child for assessments by, say, for example, a school psychologist. So the process to get a child to referral to a school psychologist is much more extensive. And one of the primary reasons for that is because the federal government really wants students to remain in their general ed environment, if at all possible. They want them to remain there because that's the least restrictive environment. And so the law, Public Law 94-142 that you mentioned, that was passed by Congress in 1975, has been reauthorized a number of times since then, and even the name has changed. Now it's known as IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Oh, okay.
And so now those same students that were back in the late 70s, early 80s that were referred to as your special education students under Public Law 94-142 are now covered under federal law IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So the federal government really and truly has kind of intervened on behalf and said, you can only go into, you can only qualify for special ed services and receive those services once you have gone through this due process, tiered level of intervention. And then you will go into a referral for a school psychologist to do an assessment. And that assessment involves things such as, it's a multidisciplinary assessment. It involves a school psychologist assessing intellectual, cognitive abilities, so there's an IQ test that's done, and then there's achievement testing that's done. And so what the psychologist is looking at is what's going on in the brain that is manifested through these various assessments that might indicate that there are processing deficits in the brain that are occurring, that are really being manifested in this learning issue that this child is having. And so after that assessment is done, a committee will reconvene, and obviously during the intervention stages prior to this, committees have been meeting with parents and so forth, and a parent always has to give their permission for an assessment to be conducted on their child. But once that assessment's done, committee reconvenes, and then they make a determination as to whether or not, based on all of the assessments, all of the interventions, as to whether or not this child has a learning disability. Now, in the state of Georgia, a child can have a learning disability in more than one area. And so the learning disability could be in the area of written expression, which means a child has difficulty with writing. It could be with the actual writing format. The child's writing skills may be illegible. Or it could be something involving the reversal of letters. So it could be written expression. The child could qualify in the area of math calculation or math reasoning, which would look at the context of math word problems. Then reading comprehension is another area of eligibility under learning disabilities, and then word recognition. And so all of these areas are tested, and then we look at the intellectual scores, we look at the scores on the achievement assessments, we look at how is this child doing every single day in their classes. Is this an issue that is manifested at home? Is it manifested elsewhere? And in the school environment, which is the area that we are most interested in. And then, if that's the case, then an eligibility meeting is held, and that child's eligibility is determined based upon what that team sees in the total picture of this child. And these scores have to impact the child's learning. So a child could have a learning disability but be compensating for it.
Right.
And be making A's in school. Now, conceivably, that's kind of hard to do,
Right.
but, you know, is it possible? Absolutely, it's possible. But does it happen often? No. But we do have children who have minor learning disabilities, mild learning disabilities, that by the time they get into high school, they are very capable of compensating with some interventions that are provided by the general ed teacher, and they don't need any pull-out resource special education services. So once the eligibility has been determined, then an IEP is written, and then we go through this due process of, okay, how is it best to serve this child? And we look at a continuum of services for that student, and we look at ancillary services, or is there anything else the child needs in the way of assistive technology, and sometimes there are additional assessments like an assistive technology assessment that might be conducted, and it may be determined that the child with a written expression issue might need a laptop computer to do, you know, the work on, the school work on. And so whatever that committee determines is needed for that student to be able to be successful in that school environment, not necessarily with an A, but be able to function in that school environment and be, you know, be successful.
Yeah.
Then the school system is responsible for providing that.
And I think that's the key, is to making sure that reasonable accommodation.
Yes.
And making sure that all children have the reasonable accommodation to be successful, have the opportunity to be successful.
Yes.
And that's what's important.
Yes.
And regardless of what that disability is to make sure that they have that accessibility to be successful.
Yes.
And
yes.
Unfortunately, we need to have another show, and we're not going to even get to the part, you know, I'll have to get you back on the show to talk about bullying, because I think that is important. And in light of, and we definitely want to keep in mind the recent shootings in the school. I think this is a conversation I definitely would like to have you back on the show to talk about. It's a very scary situation. Get your coffee. We'll be back with GHC Coffee Break.
$145 over 92.
180 over 111.
I had a heart attack, a cardiac arrest, and then a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure looks like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a heart attack or stroke are far from invisible or silent. Get back on your plan, or talk with your doctor to create an exercise, diet, and medication plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
If I would have followed a treatment plan, I would not be in this situation.
Welcome back to GHC Coffee Break. Sherry, thank you for joining me today. So much information, very valuable. Hopefully you out there in the audience will be able to take this information and use it. Unfortunately, our time ran out. I'd like to have you back on the show to talk about bullying some in the near future. Again, thank you, Sherry.
Thank you.
Until next time on GHC Coffee Break, we'll see you. Have a great day.